This move initiates the English opening, a flexible strategic choice that controls the d5 square and prepares to develop pieces to active squares, often leading to less explored and more positional battles compared to 1 e4 or 1 d4 openings. Black immediately contests the center with a symmetrical pawn push, aiming to prevent White's central pawn majority and preparing to challenge White's control of d4. Developing the knight towards the center prepares for kingside castling and supports the advance of central pawns, aiming for a flexible setup against the Sicilian defense. This move develops a knight and controls central squares, preparing to meet White's central pawn advance and leading towards common variations of the English opening or Sicilian defense. This move develops a knight towards the center and prepares to control key central squares, often leading into the English opening or various Sicilian structures depending on Black's response. This move initiates the Maroshi bind, a powerful positional setup for White that aims to restrict Black's queenside play and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. This capture opens the c-file and challenges Black's central pawn majority, leading to a more dynamic and potentially unbalanced position typical of the open Sicilian reversed. This move develops the knight to its most natural square, recapturing the pawn and preparing to challenge White's central control, entering the open Sicilian variation. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop, supporting control of the long diagonal and preparing for kingside castling, a common theme in the King's Indian attack setup against the Sicilian. Developing the king's bishop to g7 fianchetto reinforces the center and prepares for castling kingside, typical in systems like the King's Indian attack against the Sicilian reversed. This move solidifies White's central pawn structure, preparing to develop the bishop to g2 and supporting a future e4 push. This move develops the bishop to its most natural and active diagonal, preparing to castle and control the long diagonal towards White's queenside. This move develops the bishop to a square where it supports the kingside pawn structure and prepares for castling, while also potentially eyeing the queenside or creating pressure along the c3h7 diagonal later in the game. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the pawn majority on the queenside and potentially challenging White's control of the center. This move actively develops the queen and harasses Black's queenside, forcing a response and disrupting Black's intended fianchetto development. This move develops the bishop to a square where it can support the knight and prepare for castling, while also blocking the check. This move develops the queen aggressively, aiming to put pressure on the queenside and potentially exploit weaknesses on the dark squares, while also preparing for a kingside attack by clearing the h4d8 diagonal. This move logically develops the bishop to a central square, preparing to castle queenside and connect the rooks, while also defending the c5 pawn. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, reinforcing the control of the long dark squared diagonal and preparing to castle kingside. This move prepares to develop the kingside knight to a more active square, potentially to c6 or even d7, while also opening lines for future pawn advances and supporting the d5 pawn. The move qxd8 plus exchanges the queens, simplifying the position and moving towards the endgame where White's development advantage and potential kingside space may become more pronounced. This recapture in the Sicilian dragon reversed is a strategic decision to trade queens, simplifying the position and entering a middle game where Black's king will be forced to navigate open lines. This move prepares to contest the vital open c-file and allows for further development of the Queenside pieces. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the d4 square and potentially support a kingside fianchetto or control the c7 square. This exchange simplifies the position, removing the knight from d5 and opening the d-file for white's rook, aiming to exploit the weakened central pawn structure. This recapture is essential to consolidate material equality and activate the bishop, which now controls the important light squares along the long diagonal and supports the knight on a6. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, preparing to castle kingside and placing pressure on the d5 pawn while supporting the knight on c3. This move strategically bolsters the pawn structure, preparing to defend the weakened kingside squares and potentially challenge the opponent's central control. This move prophylactically prevents black from developing their queenside knight to b4, which could otherwise attack white's bishop on c3 and potentially disrupt white's coordination. The king is moved to a more active central square, preparing to participate in the endgame play and potentially connect the rooks. Castling kingside is a natural developing move, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks, a crucial step in consolidating your position after white's queen trade. The rook now unblocks the c-file and prepares to contest it, a crucial open file that will become strategically important for both sides as the game progresses. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on the queenside, eyeing potential advances like b4 and supporting the pawn chain while preparing to defend the kingside if needed. This move develops the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest the central squares and potentially support a d5 pawn push later in the game. This move challenges black's pawn chain, aiming to open lines on the queenside and potentially create play against the c-pawn or secure space for a queenside expansion. This move resolves the doubled pawns for black, simplifying the position and creating a more harmonious pawn structure, though it gives white a slight advantage in space on the queenside due to the a3-b4 pawn advance. The capture of the bishop on g2 activates the king, bringing it closer to the center of the board to participate in the endgame. This exchange simplifies the position, opening the c-file for black's rook and allowing them to contest white's central pawn majority, while simultaneously developing their own piece activity. This move forces the black king to a more exposed square, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and gain an advantage in space. The king's repositioning to d7 aims to centralize the monarch and prepare for its active participation in the middle game while consolidating black's somewhat compromised pawn structure. The bishop's retreat to c3 is a strategic repositioning to contest the d4 square and prepare for future pawn advances on the queenside, while keeping an eye on the central files. This move challenges white's centralized pieces and aims to simplify the position by exchanging knights, potentially leading to an endgame where black's pieces are more active. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, preparing to contest the crucial d5 square and support potential pawn advances on the queenside. The move 22. Bh6 aims to activate the bishop by placing it on a more dynamic diagonal, potentially challenging white's control of the center and preparing for future pawn breaks. This move shores up the central pawn structure and prepares to bring the king into a more active role, potentially supporting a pawn push or consolidating the position. This move sacrifices the bishop to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, aiming to exploit the now doubled and isolated pawns on the c-file. Capturing on e3 opens the f-file for your rook and creates an open position where your knights can become more active. but it also weakens your kingside pawn structure by creating doubled pawns. This move brilliantly exploits the weakened king's position and the hanging knight on e3, forcing a decisive material gain and fundamentally altering the pawn structure. The king is brought forward to centralize and support the queenside pawns, aiming to activate this currently passive piece in the endgame. This capture of the rook is a tactical blunder, allowing white to regain material advantage and disrupt black's defensive setup. This move recaptures the knight and simplifies the position, entering an endgame where white's slightly better pawn structure and activity should offer an advantage. This move aims to simplify the position by exchanging rooks on the open c-file, a necessary step to alleviate the pressure on black's weakened pawn structure after white's recent exchanges. With white's bishop now actively participating on the long diagonal, this recapture aims to simplify the position and potentially exploit the weaknesses in black's pawn structure after the material exchange. This move repositions the rook to the open c-file, preparing to contest control and potentially pressure white's remaining pieces. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the d5 pawn and preparing to support a potential kingside attack or defend against black's centralizing pieces. This move initiates a tactical sequence, aiming to exploit the newly opened c-file and pressure white's isolated a3 pawn while simultaneously threatening white's bishop on b2. This move aims to exploit the pin on the knight by capturing the bishop, creating a strong passed pawn on the d-file and opening lines for white's rook. This move aims to harass white's rook and queenside pawns, but it's a desperate attempt to create complications in a position where black is already significantly disadvantaged due to the loss of material and poor king's safety. The king retreats to safety, seeking to regroup and consolidate the remaining pieces after the exchange of queens and rooks. This move captures a rook, but it neglects king's safety by bringing the rook into a position where it can be attacked by white's king and knight, potentially leading to material loss or a compromised king position. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to support the d-pawn and potentially attack the black pieces controlling the c-file. This move aims to create a connected passed pawn on the queenside, a valuable asset that can become a strategic target for white's limited forces to defend. This move activates the knight, preparing to challenge black's rook on the a2 square and potentially create new attacking opportunities by aiming towards the kingside or center. This pawn advance breaks the blockade and aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside while disrupting white's control of the b-file and potentially opening lines for black's rook. This move aims to centralize the king, bringing it into the game to support the pawns and potentially target black's isolated queenside pawns. This move a5 aims to create an immediate queenside pawn threat, either by expanding the pawn chain or by preparing to advance the b-pawn further after white's king moves. The king ventures into the center to contest the open files and support the advanced queenside pawns, aiming to participate actively in the endgame. The rook on a2 eyes the now vulnerable b-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. The move h4 aims to restrict the black king's advancement and potentially create an outside passed pawn for white on the kingside, while also preparing to attack black's queenside pawns. The black king steps forward, centralizing itself to potentially support its advanced passed pawn and participate in the endgame action. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, attacking the pawn on a5 and supporting the advance of the passed pawn on b4, while also preparing to contest control of the a-file. This rook move challenges white's king and aims to infiltrate the queenside, potentially creating complications on the queenside or forcing further exchanges. This move activates the bishop, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially target black's weakened kingside pawn. Structure. This rook move aims to activate the piece on the open e-file, targeting the vulnerable kingside and potentially creating passed pawns from the queenside pawns that have advanced. This move aims to prevent the black rook from occupying the a2 square, thereby maintaining control of the central files and preparing for further pawn advances or piece activity. The move 38, RB1 activates the rook to an open file, preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file and potentially advance the b-pawn to create threats on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, threatening to exchange itself for black's rook on b1 and simplifying the position, or forcing black to move the rook and potentially create pawn weaknesses. This move aims to activate the pawn on e5, supporting the knight's maneuver to f6 and potentially challenging white's central control by opening up lines for black's pieces. The pawn advance to g4 aims to create space and potential attacking opportunities on the kingside, while also preventing black's knight from easily reaching f5. This check forces the white king to move, preventing white from consolidating their position and potentially allowing black to improve their rook activity on the open c-file. This move repositions the king to a more active central square, aiming to support the queenside pawns and prepare for potential king activity in the endgame. The black king centralizes aggressively, aiming to participate in the endgame action and support its pawn majority on the queenside. The bishop now retreats to g5, defending the knight on f1 and preparing to regroup, as the active rook on c1 has been neutralized. This is a well-timed discovered check and intermediate move, forcing the king to a slightly less safe square, potentially setting up a tactic or simplifying the position favorably if white is forced to move the king again. This move repositions the king to a safer square, centralizing it and preparing to potentially support the d-pawn or advance into the center as the position opens up. The rook's advance to h1 aims to activate the piece on an open file and pressure white's king by potentially cutting off escape squares, creating tactical opportunities. This move aims to maintain the king's safety and potentially prepare for further pawn advances on the kingside while keeping options open for counterplay. This move continues black's attempt to disrupt white's king safety by bringing the rook to the h-file, creating potential pressure along the kingside. This move is a critical tactical blow that exploits the weakened square g7, forcing the black king into a more exposed position and setting up further attacks or material gains. This move seeks to consolidate the king's position and prepare for further centralization, aiming to become an active participant in the endgame play. The recapture of the pawn on h7 removes a key defensive piece for black, weakening their kingside and opening lines for white's attack. This move aims to disrupt white's king safety and potentially win material by exploiting the exposed king and the undefended g2 pawn. White consolidates the king's safety and prepares to exploit the open central files while white's king seeks refuge on the kingside. This pawn advance aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, but it risks overextension and may be vulnerable to counterplay on the open b-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to attack the opponent's advanced b-pawn and potentially create weaknesses in their queenside pawn structure while defending the knight. This move offers a final check, forcing white's king to a more exposed square and allowing black to maintain pressure with the rook. while preparing to advance the queenside pawns. This move re-establishes the king's safety and prepares to contest the c-file, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces. Black reinforces the pawn chain with rc7, preparing to activate the rook on the c-file and contest control of this open line against white's bishop.